The cantina buzzed with noise, a mix of alien languages, clinking glasses, and the hum of poorly tuned music. Ethan sat alone, nursing a drink he couldn't identify and didn't particularly like. Zelara Station wasn't his favorite stop, but the job paid well, and he had no reason to complain, yet. He leaned back in his seat, casually watching the room for anything out of the ordinary. Then she walked in. She didn't just enter the cantina, she commanded it. Light purple skin with a faint glow under the harsh lights, silver hair that flowed down her back in perfect waves, and eyes that seemed to pierce through the crowd. The rest of her didn't exactly hurt the view either, with curves that made even the station's most seasoned patrons sit up and take notice. Ethan immediately looked away, but not before she caught his eye. For half a second, her gaze locked onto his, and he swore he saw a smirk tug at the corner of her mouth. Not interested, he muttered to himself, taking another sip of the drink. A moment later, a shadow fell across his table. He glanced up, annoyed, only to find her standing there, one hand on her hip. "You're in my seat," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an edge. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Didn't see your name on it." Her smirk returned, sharper this time. "Funny. Move, or I'll move you. Try me." Before the tension could escalate, the room seemed to shift. A group of 3 hulking aliens in battle-scarred armor entered, their eyes scanning the cantina before locking onto her. Ethan noticed her stance shift, still relaxed, but subtly ready for action. "Jira!" the largest of the aliens barked, his voice a gravelly roar. "You owe us! No more running!" "Running? Me?" she replied, not even bothering to turn around. "Sounds like you're confusing me with someone who cares." The lead alien snarled and lunged forward, reaching for her arm. Ethan didn't see exactly what happened next. One moment, the alien was reaching for her. The next, he was face first on the table, groaning in pain. She hadn't even broken a sweat. The cantina erupted into chaos as the other 2 charged her. Drawing weapons, chairs scraped, patrons scattered, and the bartender dove behind the counter. Jira ducked under a swing and slammed her elbow into one alien's chest. "Any chance you're going to help, or are you just going to sit there?" she called to Ethan without looking. Ethan sighed, muttered a curse, and pushed back from the table. "Fine, but if I break a rib, you're paying for it." He grabbed the arm of the closest alien and twisted hard, forcing it to drop its weapon. A quick knee to the stomach sent it sprawling. Jira had already disarmed the other, and was twisting its arm behind its back with a ferocity that made Ethan wince. The last alien stumbled back, clutching its chest. "This isn't over, Jira!" it spat, glaring at her before staggering toward the door. The room settled, and the low hum of conversation began to pick up again, as if bar fights were a regular part of the evening entertainment. Ethan looked around at the damage, overturned chairs, broken glass, and a couple of unconscious bodies. He shook his head and turned to Jira. "Not bad," he admitted. "But you've got a lot of explaining to do." She shrugged, brushing a strand of silver hair out of her face. "I didn't ask for your help. And yet, here we are," Ethan replied, crossing his arms. "I don't like getting dragged into someone else's problems without knowing why." "They were my problem," she said, her tone dismissive. "You made it yours. That's on you." Ethan took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Those guys weren't here for a friendly chat. They called you by name. Jira, right? So why don't you start by telling me what that was about?" For a moment her expression softened, and he thought she might actually answer. But before she could speak, the cantina's door slammed open. A squad of mercenaries in polished black armor stormed in, their weapons drawn and aimed directly at them. "Well," Jira muttered, glancing at Ethan, "guess we'll have to postpone story time." Ethan swore under his breath as the lead mercenary barked an order to seize them. "You've got to be kidding me." Jira flashed him a mischievous grin. "Still think you're not interested?" Ethan's first instinct was to bolt, but the mercenaries blocked every exit, their black armor gleaming under the flickering lights of the cantina. The leader, A broad-shouldered alien with glowing orange eyes and a voice like crushed gravel gestured toward them. "Jira," he said, his weapon aimed at her chest. "Hand over the cargo. We won't ask twice." Jira crossed her arms, unimpressed. "Funny. You think I have it?" "You always have it," the mercenary snapped. "Don't play games." Ethan glanced at her, frowning. "What's he talking about?" "Not now, pilot," Jira muttered, her eyes scanning the room for an opening. Ethan didn't appreciate the brush-off. "It sure seems like now is the perfect time," the leader growled. "Enough talking. Take them." The squad moved in unison, their boots clanking against the metal floor. Jira acted first, kicking over the nearest table to use as cover. "Follow me, unless you want to die," she shouted, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him down with her. "You're really selling this partnership?" he grumbled, ducking as a blast from one of the mercenaries' rifles seared past his head. Blaster fire erupted in every direction, shattering bottles and charring the walls. Patrons scrambled for cover or slipped out through the chaos, but Ethan and Jira had no such luxury. "This is your fault," Ethan yelled over the noise, firing off a shot with the sidearm he'd tucked into his jacket. He wasn't a great marksman, but it was enough to keep the mercenaries from closing in too quickly. "My fault," Jira hissed, her silver hair glowing faintly in the dim light. She leaned out from behind the table and fired a compact energy pistol with deadly precision, hitting one of the mercenaries square in the chest. "I wasn't the one who sat in my seat." Ethan stared at her incredulously. "You're holding. A grudge about that now?" Another blaster bolt zipped past, forcing them both to duck lower. Jira pointed toward the back of the cantina. "There's a maintenance hatch behind the bar. We can get out that way." "Great plan, except we're pinned down," Ethan snapped, firing another shot. Jira rolled her eyes. "Fine, cover me." Before Ethan could argue, she leapt over the table, firing rapidly as she sprinted toward the bar. Her movements were fast, almost too fast for him to follow, and the mercenaries struggled to keep up. He cursed under his breath and rose to provide cover fire, taking out one of the advancing troops. Jira slid over the bar, landing behind it just as another blaster shot obliterated a row of bottles above her head. She crouched low and waved at Ethan. "Move it, pilot." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He bolted toward her, dodging blasts and vaulting over a toppled chair. Just as he reached the bar, the mercenary leader roared and fired a massive, glowing projectile that obliterated the table they'd been using as cover. The shockwave sent Ethan sprawling behind the bar, landing hard beside Jira. "Smooth," she said, smirking as she reached for a hidden panel in the floor. "Remind me to thank you properly later," Ethan grunted, pulling himself up. "Is this hatch going to take us somewhere that doesn't involve getting shot at?" "Depends," Jira replied, pulling the panel free to reveal a narrow shaft. "How do you feel about ventilation systems?" Ethan groaned. "Fantastic." The sound of heavy boots approaching cut off any further complaints. Jira shoved him toward the shaft. "Go!" He slid in feet first, wincing as the metal walls scraped against his shoulders. Jira followed, slamming the hatch shut behind her just as a barrage of blaster fire struck the bar. The shaft was cramped and poorly lit, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. Ethan crawled forward, his breathing heavy. "So, care to explain why we're running for our lives? Or is that another story for later?" Jira's voice echoed faintly behind him. "Let's just say I borrowed something from the wrong people." "That's not an explanation. That's an excuse." "Fine," she snapped. "They think I have a piece of cargo that could tip the balance of power in this sector. And since they're after us, they probably think you have it too." Ethan stopped crawling and turned his head to glare at her. "I don't have anything." "Yeah," she said, grinning despite the tight space. "Try telling them that." A metallic clang echoed through the shaft, followed by the sound of something heavy being pried open. Jira's grin faded. "They're cutting into the vents. Faster, pilot." Ethan muttered every curse he knew and picked up the pace, crawling toward the faint light ahead. "You better have a way out of this." Jira smirked again, despite the growing danger. "Don't I always?" Ethan tumbled out of the ventilation shaft and into a dimly lit maintenance corridor, the harsh clang of his boots against the floor echoing through the narrow space. He stood, brushing off dust and muttering, "Ventilation systems, always a blast." Jira landed behind him with feline grace, barely making a sound as she rose to her feet. "Move," she ordered, already striding toward a hatch at the far end of the corridor. "You could at least say thank you," Ethan muttered, jogging to keep up. "I didn't have to get shot at for you." She glanced at him, one brow arching. "You're alive, aren't you?" "Debatable," he shot back, "especially since they're probably cutting through this section as we speak." As if on cue, the sound of grinding metal filled the corridor, followed by the sharp, rhythmic pounding of boots. Ethan swore under his breath and quickened his pace. "Where does this hatch lead?" "To the docks," Jira replied, pulling a small device from her belt and pressing it against the control panel. The hatch hissed open, revealing the sprawling chaos of Zaylara Station's docking bay. Ethan stepped through and took in the scene. Ships of all shapes and sizes were scattered across the bay, from sleek starfighters to bulky freighters. Mechanics and dock workers bustled about, oblivious to the danger heading their way. "Which ship is yours?" Jira asked, scanning the rows of vessels. "The Nomad," Ethan replied, pointing toward a mid-sized freighter parked at the edge of the bay. Its hull was scuffed and battered, but it had held together through worse. "And you're not touching her controls." "Relax, pilot," Jira said with a smirk. "I prefer to crash my own ships." "That's comforting," he muttered, leading the way. The sound of shouting and blaster fire erupted from the corridor behind them, cutting through the din of the docking bay. Dock workers scattered, some diving behind crates while others ran for cover. Ethan and Jira broke into a sprint. "You have a plan for when we get there?" Ethan asked, his breath coming fast. "Of course," Jira replied, her tone maddeningly casual. "What is it?" "Get in! Take off! Don't die!" Ethan groaned. "Fantastic plan! Really detailed!" Blaster bolts zipped past them, striking the ground and sending sparks flying. The mercenaries had emerged from the corridor, their leader, shouting orders as they spread out across the bay. Ethan reached the ship first, slamming his hand against the control panel to lower the boarding ramp. "Get inside!" he shouted, drawing his blaster and firing a few shots to cover Jira's approach. She darted up the ramp, moving like a shadow, and disappeared into the ship. Ethan followed, slapping the control panel again to close the ramp just as another volley of blaster fire struck the hull. Inside, Jira was already at the cockpit, flipping switches and scanning the controls. "Where's the ignition?" she asked, her voice calm despite the chaos outside. Ethan pushed past her and dropped into the pilot's seat. "I said you're not touching anything. Strap in." His hands moved quickly over the console, bringing the ship's systems online. The Nomad hummed to life, its engines roaring as the docking bay's overhead lights flickered. The comm crackled to life, and a gruff voice barked, "Freighter! Nomad, stand down and surrender. You are harboring a fugitive." Ethan gritted his teeth, flipping a switch to cut the comm. "They're not big on negotiations, are they?" Jira leaned casually against the co-pilot's seat, a smirk playing on her lips. "You'll get used to it." The ship shuddered as something struck its side, probably a grappling hook or magnet. Ethan cursed and hit the thrusters, sending the Nomad lurching forward. The sudden motion threw a few dock workers to the ground and nearly toppled a stack of crates. "You could warn me next time," Jira said, gripping the edge of the console for balance. "Wouldn't want to spoil the surprise," Ethan replied, pulling hard on the controls to angle the ship toward the station's force-fielded exit. Alarms blared as the Nomad picked up speed, weaving between other ships and cargo containers. A massive explosion rocked the docking bay behind them, sending debris flying. Ethan glanced at the sensors and saw the mercenaries' ship taking off in pursuit. "Let me guess," he said, adjusting the shields. "You've got a history with these guys?" "They're predictable," Jira replied with a shrug. "You, on the other hand, are a wild card." "Glad to keep things interesting," Ethan muttered, focusing on the rapidly approaching exit. The Nomad burst through the force field and into the star-speckled void, its engines straining as Ethan pushed them to their limits. The mercenaries' ship followed, its weapons lighting up the dark. Plasma bolts streaked past the Nomad, some grazing its shields and others narrowly missing. Jira slid into the co-pilot's seat, her fingers dancing over the console. "Do you have any countermeasures on this thing?" "Basic flares," Ethan replied, his voice tight. "Nothing fancy." "That'll have to do." She activated the flares, sending a burst of glowing decoys behind them. The mercenaries' plasma bolts veered off course, giving the Nomad a momentary reprieve. Ethan glanced at her. "This is your fault, you know." She smirked. "You're welcome for the adventure." Ethan tightened his grip on the controls, sweat beading on his forehead, as the Nomad lurched to avoid another barrage of plasma fire. The mercenaries were relentless, their sleek pursuit ship gaining ground despite Jira's improvised countermeasures. The cockpit vibrated with each near miss, the shields groaning under the strain. "You call this an adventure?" Ethan shot back, his tone equal parts panic and frustration. "Feels more like a death wish." She laughed, the sound light and genuine, cutting through the lingering adrenaline like a bomb. "Admit it, you're having fun." Ethan shook his head, but a small smile crept onto his lips. "You're insane, you know that?" "Maybe," she said, leaning back in her seat. "But you're still here." For a moment, the tension between them shifted, the danger fading into the background as they shared a brief, unspoken understanding. But the moment didn't last. The comm crackled to life, interrupting the silence. "Unknown vessel, identify yourself immediately," a stern voice demanded. Ethan groaned. "Great. What now?" Shira's smirk returned, sharper than ever. "Guess we're about to find out." Ethan stared at the comm controls, debating whether to respond or ignore the transmission entirely. Jira leaned closer, her expression alight with curiosity and mischief. "Do you always have this much trouble wherever you go?" he asked, his voice tinged with exasperation. "Only when I'm with you," she quipped, clearly enjoying herself. "Come on, answer it. Let's see what they want." Ethan sighed and tapped the comm. "This is the freighter Nomad. Who's asking?" "This is Commander Varek of the Confederation Patrol. You are entering restricted space. State your business or prepare to be boarded." Jira's grin widened. "Confederation Patrol. They're persistent." Ethan shot her a glare. "Do. They know you too." "Not personally," she said with a shrug. "But they don't like anyone who gets in their way." "Fantastic," Ethan muttered, pressing the comm again. "Commander Varek, we're just passing through. No need." "To board." "There is every need," the commander replied sharply. "Your ship matches the description of a fugitive's escape vessel. Cut your engines and prepare for inspection." Shira crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "We can't let them board. They'll find me." "No kidding," Ethan muttered. "Got any tricks up your sleeve?" "Plenty," she said. "But let's start with running." Before Ethan could protest, Jira reached over and pushed the throttle forward, sending the Nomad into a sharp acceleration. The cockpit rattled as the ship's engines roared, streaking past the patrol cruiser that had moved into intercept position. "Are you insane?" Ethan shouted, wrestling the controls back from her. "You're going to get us blasted into space dust." "They'll fire either way," Jira replied, her tone maddeningly calm. "Might as well make them work for it." The comm erupted with angry shouts from Commander Varek, followed by the unmistakable hum of targeting systems locking onto their ship. Ethan gritted his teeth, his hands flying over the controls to engage evasive maneuvers. The first volley of plasma fire missed narrowly, the bolts streaking past the Nomad and exploding harmlessly in the void. Ethan rolled the ship, banking. Hard to avoid a second volley. Jira clung to the console, her confidence unshaken. "I hope your ship is as tough as you think it is," she said, watching the sensors as the cruiser began to close the gap. "Tough, yes. Invincible, no," Ethan shot back. "Any chance you can distract them?" Jira's lips curled into a sly smile. "I thought you'd never ask." She darted out of the cockpit before he could stop her, heading for the rear of the ship. Ethan cursed under his breath but stayed focused on the controls, weaving through the scattered debris of a long-forgotten battle. Wrecked ships floated aimlessly, their twisted hulls casting ominous shadows. Moments later, the comm crackled again. "Freighter Nomad, cease all evasive actions immediately. You are surrounded." "Great," Ethan muttered. "Now what?" Jira's voice came through the ship's internal comm. "Get ready for a light show." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, the Nomad shuddered, and a cascade of flares and chaff exploded from its rear compartments. The sudden burst of bright light and metallic fragments filled the void, temporarily blinding the patrol cruiser's targeting systems. Ethan seized the opportunity, pushing the ship's engines to their limit. The Nomad shot forward, leaving the cruiser momentarily disoriented in its wake. "Nice move," Ethan admitted, as Jira returned to the cockpit, a satisfied smirk on her face. "Thanks," she said, sliding back into the co-pilot's seat. "You're not bad yourself, pilot." Ethan rolled his eyes but couldn't hide the faint grin tugging at his lips. "You're a menace, you know that?" "Part of my charm," she replied, her tone playful. The sensors lit up again, signaling the patrol cruiser's renewed pursuit. Ethan groaned. "They're not giving up." "Then we'll have to lose them for good," Jira said, her gaze shifting to the navigation screen. "What's that sector over there?" Ethan followed her gaze, his stomach sinking as he saw the highlighted region. "That's the red veil, a dense nebula full of ion storms and magnetic anomalies. Ships go in and don't come out." "Perfect," Jira said, her eyes gleaming. "Let's go." "Are you trying to get us killed?" Ethan asked, incredulous. "Not today," she said with a wink. "Trust me." Against his better judgment, Ethan angled the Nomad toward the nebula. The ship's warning systems blared. As they approached, the swirling red clouds of the red veil growing larger on the viewport. "This is a terrible idea," Ethan muttered. "You'll thank me later," Jira replied. The Nomad plunged into the nebula, its sensors immediately going haywire as the magnetic anomalies scrambled their readings. Ethan gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white, as the ship was buffeted by powerful ion currents. Behind them, the patrol cruiser hesitated at the edge of the red veil. Its captain barked orders, but the ship's movements were cautious, unwilling to risk the unpredictable dangers of the nebula. "Looks like they're scared," Jira said, her tone triumphant. "Smartest thing they've done all day," Ethan muttered, focusing on keeping the Nomad in one piece. As they delved deeper into the red veil, the patrol cruiser finally broke off its pursuit, retreating to safer space. Ethan let out a shaky breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "See?" Jira said, flashing him a victorious grin. "Told you we'd make it." Ethan shook his head, a mix of frustration and admiration in his expression. "You're impossible. And you love it," she teased. He didn't answer, but the faint smile on his face said enough. The swirling chaos of the red veil enveloped the Nomad, its crimson tendrils pulsing with energy as the ship pushed deeper into the nebula. The constant jolts and groans of the hull made every second a test of endurance for Ethan, his focus razor-sharp on the controls. Beside him, Jira gazed at the viewports, her expression equal parts awe and calculation. "You weren't kidding about the storms," she said, her voice softer now. "It's beautiful, in a terrifying way. I'd appreciate it more if it wasn't trying to kill us," Ethan replied, his tone clipped as he adjusted for another violent current. "This place is tearing the ship apart. We can't stay here long." Jira's eyes narrowed as she studied the navigation screen, now flickering with static. We just need to find a stable pocket to regroup. There's always a way through these things." Ethan glanced at her, incredulous. "You're remarkably optimistic for someone whose plans usually involve explosions and chaos." "I call it resourceful," she countered with a small smirk. "And so far we're still breathing, aren't we?" "Barely," he muttered, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. Against all odds, they'd survived everything so far, thanks in no small part to her quick thinking and uncanny knack for improvisation. The ship jolted violently, and the cockpit lights dimmed as another wave of ion energy surged through the nebula. Jira braced herself, her hand gripping the edge of the console. "Shields are down to 20%, she noted, her tone serious now. "We need to find cover, fast." Ethan's jaw tightened as he scanned the viewport, searching for anything that resembled safety in the ever-shifting red haze. The ship's systems struggled to keep up, warning indicators flaring across the displays. "There," Jira said, suddenly pointing to a cluster of faintly glowing rocks in the distance. "That asteroid field. It might have a hollow big enough to hide in." "Or it's filled with more things trying to kill us," Ethan shot back, but he adjusted course regardless. At this point, any option was better than staying exposed in the storm. As they approached the asteroid field, the turbulence began to lessen, the dense rocks offering a reprieve from the worst of the ion currents. Ethan maneuvered the Nomad carefully, threading it between jagged formations until they reached a large, hollowed-out asteroid. The ship slid inside, its engines finally quieting as Ethan powered down to standby mode. For a moment, silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the faint hum of the ship's core systems. Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. "Well, that was fun." Jira chuckled, a soft sound that seemed out of place after the chaos. "Admit it, you're getting used to this." "I'm getting used to surviving," he corrected, his tone teasing despite his exhaustion. "There's a difference." She tilted her head, studying him with a faint smile. "You handle it better than most would. That's something." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Is that your way of saying I'm growing on you?" "Maybe," she said, her smile turning playful. "Or maybe I just enjoy seeing you squirm." He laughed, shaking his head. "You're impossible." "And yet, here we are," she said, her gaze softening, still in one piece. The moment lingered, the tension between them shifting into something warmer, more intimate. Ethan met. Her eyes, his usual guarded expression giving way to a hint of vulnerability. "Let's go." "Are you trying to get us killed?" Ethan asked, incredulous. "Not today," she said with a wink. "Trust me." Against his better judgment, Ethan angled the Nomad toward the nebula. The ship's warning systems blared. As they approached, the swirling red clouds of the red veil growing larger on the viewport. "This is a terrible idea," Ethan muttered. "You'll thank me later," Jira replied. The Nomad plunged into the nebula, its sensors immediately going haywire as the magnetic anomalies scrambled their readings. Ethan gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white, as the ship was buffeted by powerful ion currents. Behind them, the patrol cruiser hesitated at the edge of the red veil. Its captain barked orders, but the ship's movements were cautious, unwilling to risk the unpredictable dangers of the nebula. "Looks like they're scared," Jira said, her tone triumphant. "Smartest thing they've done all day," Ethan muttered, focusing on keeping the Nomad in one piece. As they delved deeper into the red veil, the patrol cruiser finally broke off its pursuit, retreating to safer space. Ethan let out a shaky breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "See," Jira said, flashing him a victorious grin. "Told you we'd make it." Ethan shook his head, a mix of frustration and admiration in his expression. "You're impossible. And you love it," she teased. He didn't answer, but the faint smile on his face said enough. The swirling chaos of the red veil enveloped. The Nomad, its crimson tendrils pulsing with energy as the ship pushed deeper into the nebula. The constant jolts and groans of the hull made every second a test of endurance for Ethan, his focus razor-sharp on the controls. Beside him, Jira gazed at the viewports, her expression equal parts awe and calculation. "You weren't kidding about the storms," she said, her voice softer now. "It's beautiful, in a terrifying way. I'd appreciate it more if it wasn't trying to kill us," Ethan replied, his tone clipped as he adjusted for another violent current. "This place is tearing the ship apart. We can't stay here long." Jira's eyes narrowed as she studied the navigation screen, now flickering with static. "We just need to find a stable pocket to regroup. There's always a way through these things." Ethan glanced at her, incredulous. "You're remarkably optimistic for someone whose plans usually involve explosions and chaos." "I call it resourceful," she countered with a small smirk. "And so far we're still breathing, aren't we?" "Barely," he muttered, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. Against all odds, they'd survived everything so far, thanks in no small part to her quick thinking and uncanny knack for improvisation. The ship jolted violently, and the cockpit lights dimmed as another wave of ion energy surged through the nebula. Jira braced herself, her hand gripping the edge of the console. "Shields are down to 20%, she noted, her tone serious now. "We need to find cover, fast." Ethan's jaw tightened as he scanned the viewport, searching for anything that resembled safety in the ever-shifting red haze. The ship's systems struggled to keep up, warning indicators flaring across the displays. "There," Jira said, suddenly, pointing to a cluster of faintly glowing rocks in the distance. "That asteroid field. It might have a hollow big enough to hide in. Or it's filled with more things trying to kill us," Ethan shot back. But he adjusted course regardless. At this point, any option was better than staying exposed in the storm. As they approached the asteroid field, the turbulence began to lessen, the dense rocks offering a reprieve from the worst of the ion currents. Ethan maneuvered the Nomad carefully, threading it between jagged formations until they reached a large, hollowed-out asteroid. The ship slid inside, its engines finally quieting as Ethan powered down to standby mode. For a moment, silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the faint hum of the ship's core systems. Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. "Well, that was fun." Jira chuckled, a soft sound that seemed out of place after the chaos. "Admit it. You're getting used to this." "I'm getting used to surviving," he corrected, his tone teasing despite his exhaustion. "There's a difference." She tilted her head, studying him with a faint smile. "You handle it better than most would. That's something." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Is that your way of saying I'm growing on you?" "Maybe," she said, her smile turning playful. "Or maybe I just enjoy seeing you squirm." He laughed, shaking his head. "You're impossible." "And yet, here we are," she said, her gaze softening. Still in one piece. The moment lingered, the tension between them shifting into something warmer, more intimate. Ethan met. Her eyes, his usual guarded expression giving way to a hint of vulnerability. For all her bravado and sharp wit, there was something disarming about her in these quieter moments, a depth he hadn't expected. "Why do you do it?" he asked suddenly. "The running, the chaos, all of it. What are you looking for?" Jira's smile faded, replaced by a contemplative look. She leaned back in her seat, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the console. "Freedom," she said after a pause. "From expectations, from people who think they can control me. Out. Here it's just me and the stars, no rules, no strings." Ethan nodded slowly, her words resonating more than he cared to admit. "I get that, but running only gets you so far. Sooner or later, you have to stop and face what you're running from." Her gaze flicked to him, sharp but not unkind. "What? About you, pilot? What are you running from?" He hesitated, the question cutting deeper than he expected. Nothing as dramatic as you, he said finally, deflecting with a faint smile. Just trying to make it through the next day. She studied him for a moment longer, as if deciding whether to press further, but then she nodded. Fair enough. The hum of the ship's systems filled the silence again, a reminder of the fragile bubble they'd carved out in the chaos. Outside, the nebula's crimson light bathed the asteroid's interior, casting long shadows across the cockpit. So what's the plan now? Ethan asked, breaking the quiet. Hide here until the nebula clears up? Jira's smirk returned, her earlier seriousness fading. What, and miss out on the adventure? Where's your sense of fun? Fun? That's what you call this? He gestured to the damaged ship around them. She laughed, the sound lighter this time. Relax, pilot. We'll patch her up and be on our way. Besides, you'd miss me if I wasn't around to keep things interesting. Ethan shook his head, a reluctant grin tugging at his lips. Your trouble, Zira. Big purple trouble. And yet you haven't kicked me out of the airlock, she teased. That has to count for something. He chuckled, the sound mingling with hers as the tension of the past hours finally began to ebb. For the first time in what felt like forever, the danger felt distant, replaced by a tentative connection that neither of them could quite put into words. The Nomad rested uneasily within the hollowed-out asteroid, its battered hull a testament to the chaos it had just endured. Ethan leaned against the console, reviewing the ship's diagnostics with a mix of relief and concern. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but they wouldn't last much longer without repairs. Jira emerged from the back of the cockpit, carrying a toolkit and a satisfied grin. Good news, I managed to jury-rig the power couplings. We'll be fine for now. Define? Fine, Ethan said without looking up, his tone skeptical. Functional, she replied. Mostly. Don't fly into another storm, and we'll be golden. Reassuring, Ethan muttered, closing the diagnostic display. So, any brilliant ideas for getting out of here? Jira set the toolkit down and folded her arms, her expression thoughtful. The nebula's a mess, but it's also our best cover. If we time it right, we can ride the ion currents out without attracting any attention. You make it sound easy, Ethan said, raising an eyebrow. It's not, she admitted, her grin turning mischievous. But I've done worse. Of course you have, Ethan muttered, but there was no malice in his voice. If anything, her reckless confidence was starting to rub off on him as they prepared for departure. The ship's proximity alarm suddenly blared, jolting them both into action. Ethan's fingers flew over the controls, bringing up the external sensors. The display flickered before resolving into the unmistakable outline of another ship, sleek, angular, and bristling with weaponry. Great, Ethan said, his stomach sinking. Looks like someone found us. Jira's gaze narrowed as she studied the sensor feed. That's not Confederation, it's worse. Ethan's eyes darted to her. Worse? How? They're bounty hunters, she said, her voice grim. And not the nice kind. You know them? Ethan asked. Already running through evasive options. By reputation, she said. Let's just say they're not big on negotiation. The comm crackled to life, a deep, gravelly voice cutting through the static. Freighter Nomad, this is Captain Draxis. Power down and prepare to be boarded. You have something or someone we want. Jira's jaw tightened, and for the first time since Ethan had met her, there was a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. We can't let them board. No kidding, Ethan replied, his hands gripping the controls. Hold on. He pushed the engines to full power, the Nomad lurching out of its hiding spot and into the open. The asteroid field lit up with weapons fire as the bounty hunter ship gave chase, its precision far deadlier than the Confederation patrol. Plasma bolts streaked past, some grazing the Nomad and rattling the hull. Options? Ethan called out, his voice strained as he maneuvered through the chaotic terrain. Keep moving, Jira said, her voice steady despite the tension. If we can reach the denser part of the nebula, they'll have a harder time tracking us. And if we don't? Then we make them regret it, she said, a glint of defiance in her eyes. Ethan didn't bother arguing. He focused on the controls, weaving through the asteroid field with practiced precision. Jira disappeared into the back of the ship, returning moments later with an armful of makeshift devices. "What are those?" Ethan asked, glancing at her. "Surprises," she said, flashing him a grin. "Keep them busy for a minute." "Busy? Sure, no problem," he muttered, pushing the Nomad into a sharp dive as another volley of plasma fire exploded behind them. "Take your time." Jira worked quickly, attaching the devices to the ship's external ports and programming them through a handheld terminal. As the bounty hunter ship closed in, she slammed the final button with a flourish. "Now!" she shouted. The devices detached from the Nomad, spinning through the void before detonating in a burst of electromagnetic energy. The bounty hunter ship shuddered as its systems flickered, momentarily thrown off balance. "Nice trick," Ethan said, his tone impressed. "Thanks," Jira replied, settling into the co-pilot's seat. "But it won't hold them for long. Let's get out of here." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He pushed the Nomad into the heart of the nebula, its crimson tendrils swirling around them like a living entity. The bounty hunter ship pursued, its weapons blazing, but the nebula's volatile energy began to take its toll on both vessels. As the turbulence grew more intense, Jira leaned closer to Ethan. "You trust me?" "Do I have a choice?" he asked, his voice dry. "Not really," she said, her grin returning. "But I've got an idea." She pointed to a cluster of energy surges on the navigation screen. "If we can lure them into that pocket, the nebula will do the rest." Ethan stared at the screen, his mind racing. "That's suicide." "Only if we get caught," she said. "Do you trust me?" Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade. Against all logic, against every instinct screaming at him to run the other way, Ethan nodded. "Let's do it." Jira's smile widened, and she reached over to the controls, her fingers brushing his. Together, they guided the Nomad into the volatile pocket, its systems straining against the increasing energy. The bounty hunter ship followed, its captain unaware of the trap being set. As the energy surges reached their peak, Jira activated the ship's boosters, propelling them forward just as the pocket erupted in a violent burst of ion energy. The explosion consumed the pursuing ship, its weapons fire silenced in an instant. The Nomad emerged on the other side, battered but intact. Ethan let out a shaky breath, his grip on the controls finally relaxing. "Well," he said, glancing at Jira. "That was something." She laughed, the sound full of relief and exhilaration. "Told you we'd make it." Ethan shook his head, a reluctant grin forming. "You're unbelievable." "And you're starting to like it," she teased. He didn't deny it. The aftermath of the battle left a strange calm between them, a silence that felt more comfortable than it should have. The Nomad drifted through the outer edge of the nebula, far from the wreckage of the bounty hunter ship. Ethan and Jira sat in the cockpit, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound accompanying the steady beat of their hearts. Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his seat, his hands still gripping the controls. That was too close. Jira, though, seemed unruffled, her eyes scanning the space outside. "Close is relative. I've been in worse scrapes." He shot her a sidelong glance, half exasperated, half impressed. "You never cease to amaze me. You don't even flinch." "I'm too busy living," she said, her tone light. But there was something in her voice that made him pause. She turned toward him, catching his gaze. "But I'm not invincible, Ethan. Even I have my limits." He met her eyes, and for the first time, there was a raw honesty between them, something that wasn't hidden behind her usual bravado. "You don't have to do it all alone, you know." She looked away, a slight tension in her shoulders betraying her carefully composed exterior. "I've been alone for a long time." Maybe it's time to change that, he said quietly. The words hung between them, the weight of unspoken possibilities in the air. Jira didn't respond immediately, her gaze drifting back to the viewport. For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the ship. The stars outside seemed endless, the void stretching into infinity. But in that silence, a deeper understanding was forming. Ethan wasn't sure when the shift had happened, when. The teasing banter had turned into something more, something real. But the connection was undeniable now. Maybe it had always been there beneath the surface, simmering quietly between the chaos. "You're asking a lot," she said at last, her voice softer now. "Not everyone can handle what I carry." "I've handled worse," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. "And you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Jira's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but the walls around her softened just a fraction. She nodded, a barely perceptible shift in her demeanor. "We'll see." Ethan's chest tightened. He wasn't sure if it was hope or something else that surged within him, but he let it sit there, unspoken for the moment. "Looks like we're clear of the hunters," he said, diverting the conversation. "But we're not out of the nebula yet." "True," Jira agreed, but her smile returned, the edges tinged with a dangerous glint. "But that's half the fun, isn't it?" "I think you might be addicted to chaos," Ethan muttered, adjusting course to navigate further into the nebula. The worst of the storm was behind them, but they still had miles to go before the ship was in the clear. Jira grinned. Guilty as charged. The atmosphere in the cockpit was different now, lighter, but with an undercurrent of something deeper, something more complex. Every glance they exchanged carried the weight of their shared experiences, the bond forged in fire and near-death encounters. And even though the immediate danger was over, neither of them could shake the feeling that it was only the beginning of something far bigger. As they moved deeper into the nebula, the stars became distant pinpricks of light, swallowed by the dark expanse around them. Ethan set a course for the nearest station, anywhere that could give them a brief respite from the madness. But even as they drew closer to safety, something else lingered in the air. The growing tension between them, the recognition that what had started as a series of near-death encounters was blossoming into something else entirely. Jira stood up, stretching her arms overhead. "I'll get the engines checked. You should rest." Ethan shot her a look. "I don't need rest." "You will. Trust me," she said, a playful glint in her eye. "You've been up for too long. And besides," she took a few steps toward him, her voice dropping to a teasing whisper, "if you pass out in the chair again, I'll make sure you don't wake up until we're safely docked." "Sounds like a threat," Ethan said, his lips twitching as he tried to suppress a smile. Jira's grin widened. "Maybe a promise." He chuckled. Fine. You win. I'll rest. But only because you look so convincing when you threaten me." "Good boy," she teased, her smile lingering as she turned to leave the cockpit. As she disappeared down the hallway toward the engine room, Ethan leaned back in his seat, allowing himself to finally relax. His eyes flickered briefly to the comm screen, where a new message had appeared, flashing with a priority tag. He hesitated, then reached over and tapped the screen. The message was from a source he didn't recognize. The encryption was top tier, the kind used by high-level operatives and black market dealers. Ethan frowned as he read the text. "We know who you're traveling with, and we want her." The words sent a chill through him, an immediate icy warning that the danger was far from over. But why now? Why after everything? The screen went black before he could respond. The message vanished as if it had never been sent. Ethan sat up, straight, his instincts firing into overdrive. His thoughts raced, but one thing was clear. Jira's past wasn't just something she could outrun. It was catching up to her. He stood, shaking off the unsettling feeling gnawing at him. He had to warn her. but would she listen? Ethan made his way down the narrow hallway of the Nomad, his mind racing with the implications of the message. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Whoever had sent it knew more than they should, and they wanted Jira. He reached the engine room door, hesitating for a moment before he pressed the control panel. The door slid open with a low hum, revealing Jira crouched by the engine's maintenance panel, her toolkit spread out around her. "Jira!" Ethan called out, his voice tight with urgency. She glanced up, her brow furrowing at the expression on his face. "What's wrong?" "We have a problem," he said, stepping into the room. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Someone knows who you are, and they want you." Jira's face hardened at the words, her gaze shifting to meet his, with an intensity that made Ethan's stomach tighten. She stood up, her movements precise, like a predator preparing for a fight. "I should have known." "Who are they?" Ethan asked, his tone soft but demanding. "What's going on?" "Jira." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to a small compartment at the back of the room and pulled out a hidden data chip. She inserted it into a terminal, the screen flickering to life with encrypted files. As the documents appeared, Ethan's heart sank. "You've been running from them for a long time, haven't you?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above, a whisper. Jira's jaw clenched, and she nodded. "The Black Fang. They're a mercenary group, but they're not just any mercenaries. They deal in information, in secrets. They've been hunting me for years because of what I know." Ethan stepped closer, his hand reaching out as if to comfort her, but he hesitated. He didn't know what to say. "What is it that you know?" Jira's eyes flickered with the weight of memories, but she shook her head. "It's not something I can explain, not yet, but they won't stop until they have me." "Then we'll stop them," Ethan said, the resolve in his voice matching the fire he saw in her eyes. "We'll make them regret ever coming after you." She met his gaze for a long moment, and then something shifted. Her shoulders seemed to relax just slightly, the guard she had built around herself softening. "I don't want you to get dragged into this, Ethan. It's too dangerous." "Too bad," he replied with a half-smile. "I'm already in it." She didn't laugh, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward in what could only be called a reluctant smile. "You really are stubborn. Didn't you notice?" he teased, stepping back. "It's one of my more annoying traits." The air between them shifted again, and this time it wasn't just the tension of the hunt or the danger hanging over their heads. There was something more, something unspoken, something deepening with every passing second. Jira took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as if weighing her options. "All right, fine, but we do this my way." "Your way," Ethan repeated with a smirk. "I'm starting to think I don't have a say in this." She shot him a look, but there was something soft behind her eyes, something he hadn't seen before. "You do," she said, the words surprising him. "But only if you want to." Before he could respond, the comm panel buzzed, the urgent tone sending a chill through both of them. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Jira turned toward him, her expression hardening. "They're here," she said quietly, her voice full of unshakable resolve. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "We can't outrun them, can we?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "But we don't need to." The ship's alarms blared to life, signaling that the Black Fang had found them. Ethan's mind raced, but Jira was already moving. She grabbed a laser rifle from a nearby locker, handing it to him without hesitation. "We fight." He nodded, accepting the weapon, his pulse quickening. "Right, let's make them regret it." They moved toward the docking bay, the sounds of the Black Fang ship closing in reverberating through the Nomad. Jira's movements were fluid, precise, as she directed Ethan to the weapon systems and began to prepare the ship for a confrontation. But Ethan didn't just focus on the immediate danger. As they worked, his thoughts kept drifting back to the look in Jira's eyes. She was a survivor. She had been alone for too long, fighting battles no one could understand. But he saw, now more than ever, that she wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a bystander. The Black Fang ship's boarding ramp extended with a hiss, and Ethan heard the heavy footfalls of mercenaries moving toward the Nomad. They were close, too close. Jira turned to him, her face a mask of determination. "Ready?" He raised his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. "Born ready." The ramp opened fully, and the first wave of mercenaries stormed in. Blasts of energy lit up the hallway as Jira opened fire, her aim precise, taking down the first few attackers with deadly accuracy. Ethan followed her lead, his shots hitting their marks, but they were vastly outnumbered. Then, the ship lurched as a heavy blast struck the hull, and the power flickered. The lights went out, casting them into a deep, suffocating darkness. The comms crackled to life once more. "This is your last warning," came the cold voice of the Black Fang's captain. "Surrender now, and we'll let you live." Jira's voice was steady as she responded. "I don't think you're in a position to make demands." Ethan felt the intensity rise, the stakes higher than ever. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more personal. They had come too far. He had come too far with Jira to let them win. Suddenly, everything clicked. The crew, the mission, the threat, and the undeniable connection that had grown between them. He would protect her. The first wave of mercenaries broke through the door, and without hesitation, Ethan and Jira dove into the fray, the ship trembling with every blast, every action, every step they took toward victory. With Jira by his side, Ethan knew one thing for sure. They would survive this. And together, they'd face whatever came next. If you want to know what happens next in their fight for survival, and see how their bond deepens, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more.